My name is Henry. I've lived in this small coastal town my entire life where everyone knows everyone and secrets feel like they're written in the air for all to see. I'm 28, work at the local library. And until recently, I've kept the most essential part of myself hidden away, not just from others but sometimes even from myself. I grew up in a traditionally religious household. My parents weren't zealots, but Sunday service was non-negotiable, and the church community formed the backbone of our social life. As a child, I found comfort in the rituals, the familiar hymns, and the sense of belonging, but as I grew older and began to understand myself better, that comfort transformed into a complicated knot of guilt and fear. By my early 20s, I had stopped attending church regularly. I made excuses about work schedules and other commitments, but the truth was simpler and more difficult. I couldn't reconcile who I was with what I had been taught. My parents noticed, of course. There were gentle inquiries, invitations to special services, and occasional disappointed sighs when I declined, but they never pushed too hard, perhaps sensing there was something fragile at work that shouldn't be disturbed. Then 6 months ago, everything changed. My father had a heart attack. He survived, thankfully, but the experience shook our family to its core. In those frightening hours at the hospital waiting for news, I found myself praying for the first time in years. Not formal prayers from my childhood, but desperate pleading thoughts sent into whatever void might be listening. When my father stabilized, I felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that he would live, and guilt that it had taken such a crisis to make me reach for faith again. The Sunday after he came home from the hospital, I surprised my parents by agreeing to attend service with them. My mother cried, attributing it to joy over my father's recovery. In part, she was right. The church had changed since my youth. The old priest, Father Matthews, had retired, and a new priest had taken his place. Father Noah was younger than I expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with an easy smile and eyes that seemed to hold genuine interest. When he greeted parishioners, he spoke with my parents for a few minutes after the service, inquiring about my father's health with what appeared to be sincere concern. When he turned to me, extending his hand, I felt an unexpected jolt of connection. "You must be the elusive son I've heard about," he said, his voice warm. "I'm Father Noah Henry," I replied, surprised at how nervous I suddenly felt. "Not so elusive, just busy," he nodded, still holding my gaze. "Everyone's busy these days, but it's good to make time for what matters, isn't it?" I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and managed to smile. As we walked to the car, my mother mentioned how wonderful the new priest was how he had breathed fresh life into the congregation. I listened silently, wondering why the brief interaction had left me so unsettled. In the weeks that followed, I found myself returning to church each Sunday. I told myself it was for my parents, especially my father, whose recovery was slow but steady, but I knew there was more to it. Something about Father Noah's sermons resonated with me in a way I hadn't experienced before. He spoke less about sin and judgment, and more about passion and understanding. His interpretation of Scripture emphasized love above all else, and I found myself clinging to those words, desperate for any sign that there might be a place for me in this faith. After all, 3 months after my return to church, I began staying after services to help with community outreach programs. It started as a way to make my parents happy. They were delighted by my renewed involvement, but soon became something I genuinely looked forward to. We organized food drives, visited elderly parishioners, and renovated the church's small library. Father Noah was often present during these activities, working alongside volunteers, his sleeves rolled up and his clerical collar occasionally loosened. During these afternoons, we would sometimes talk casual conversations, at first about books. He was an avid reader, music, the town's history. He had a way of listening that made you feel as though your words mattered, as though he was absorbing every syllable. Eventually, our conversations deepened. He told me about his journey to priesthood, which hadn't been as straightforward as I'd assumed. He'd studied literature in college, spent 2 years teaching English in South America, and only then felt called to seminary. "I believe God leads us on winding paths sometimes," he said one afternoon as we sorted donated books. The Detours have purpose even when we can't see it. I wondered if he could see the purpose perp in my detours, if he could possibly understand the path I was on. There were moments when I almost told him, when the truth pressed against my lips with such force that I had to physically turn away to keep it contained, but I always held back, fearful of what might happen if I shattered this fragile connection we'd formed until last weekend, when everything changed again. I had been helping Father Noah with some administrative work in the church office. It was late afternoon and most of the volunteers had gone home. My parents had left earlier, my father still tiring easily after his health scare. We were alone in the small room adjacent to the sanctuary, the setting sun streaming through stained glass and painting the worn wooden desk between us in jeweled colors. Father Noah was talking about an upcoming youth retreat, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was caught in the same loop it had been circling for weeks, wondering what he would say if he knew the truth about me, if his compassion extended to someone like me, if his interpretation of faith had room for the person I was. Henry, his voice broke through my thoughts. You seem a million miles away. I blinked, focusing on his concerned expression. Sorry, I was just thinking about something troubling. From the look on your face, he set down his pen. Would you like to talk about it? The question hung in the air between us. I had spent so long hiding, deflecting, pretending. The weight of it suddenly felt unbearable. I don't know if I can, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Father Noah's expression softened. Sometimes the things we find hardest to say are the ones we most need to voice. I looked down at my hands, tracing the wood grain of the desk with my fingertip. I'm afraid of what you'll think, of what it means for me here. Whatever it is, Henry, this is a place of acceptance, of God's love, not judgment. I took a deep breath, then another. The words were there, had always been there, waiting to be freed. I'm gay, I said. Finally, the declaration hanging in the stillness of the church office. I've known for years, but I've never really said it out loud to anyone connected to this place, not even my parents. I couldn't look at him. The silence stretched, and with each passing second I felt my heart rate accelerate. Had I made a terrible mistake? Would he ask me to leave, quote scripture at me, tell my parents? Then I felt his hand cover mine on the desk, a brief reassuring touch. Thank you for trusting me with that, Henry, he said, his voice steady and warm. That must have been difficult to say, especially here. I looked up, surprised to find no condemnation in his eyes, only a gentle understanding. You're not disappointed, I managed. Father Noah shook his head. God created you exactly as you are, Henry. Your sexual orientation is part of that creation, not a mistake or a flaw. I stared at him, feeling something unravel inside me, a knot of tension I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't a natural part of me. But the church I began, the church has not always been a welcoming place for LGBTQ+ individuals, he acknowledged, and different denominations and individual priests hold different views, but I believe in a God of love and inclusion. I believe Jesus taught us to love our neighbors as ourselves without qualification. Tears pricked at my eyes. Unexpected and overwhelming. I stopped coming to church because I thought there wasn't a place for me here. There is always a place for you here, he said firmly, and I'm sorry if the church ever made you feel otherwise. We talked for hours after that. The sun set completely, and we turned on the small lamp on the desk, its circle of light creating an intimate space for my long-suppressed words to finally find air. I told him about realizing I was gay in high school, about the crushing fear that had accompanied that knowledge, about dates I'd gone on in neighboring towns where no one would recognize me, about the loneliness of hiding such an essential part of myself from my family and community. Father Noah listened with unwavering attention. He shared stories of other LGBTQ+ Christians he had counseled, of the theological perspectives that affirmed their identities, of his own journey toward more inclusive understanding of faith. He admitted that not everyone in the church shared his views, but emphasized that this didn't make his interpretation less valid. The greatest commandment is to love, he reminded me, not to judge, not to exclude, but to love. When we finally realized how late it had grown, he insisted on walking me to my car. The night air was cool, and the church grounds were quiet and shadowed as we Reached my vehicle, he placed a hand on my shoulder. I'm glad you told me, Henry. And I hope you'll continue to feel welcome here. I nodded, unable to fully express the relief flooding through me. Thank you for listening, for understanding. His hand lingered on my shoulder for a moment before he stepped. Back same time next Saturday for the food pantry setup. I'll be here, I promised. On the drive home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The fear wasn't gone entirely. I still hadn't told my parents, still worried about others in the congregation, but sharing my truth with Father Noah and being met with acceptance had created a crack in the wall I'd built around myself. The week that followed was transformative. I moved through my days with a new sense of possibility. At the library where I worked, I found myself suggesting LGBTQ plus inclusive literature for our next display without the usual anxiety. I smiled more easily at strangers, laughed more readily with friends. The burden of secrecy, though not entirely lifted, had shifted enough to allow me to breathe more freely. When Saturday arrived, I was eager to return to the church. The food pantry preparation was scheduled for the afternoon, but I arrived early, hoping for another opportunity to talk with Father Noah before the other volunteers appeared. I found him in the parish hall, already arranging tables and shelving units. You're early, he said, smiling as I entered, eager to sort canned goods. Something like that, I replied, moving to help him with a particularly unwieldy Actually, I wanted to thank you again for last week, for how you responded when I came out to you. He stopped, turning to face me fully. You don't need to thank me for treating you with the basic dignity you deserve, Henry. Maybe not, but it meant a lot to me anyway. I hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about what you said about God creating me as I am. I want to believe that. What's stopping you? He asked gently. I considered the question. A lifetime of messages suggesting otherwise. I suppose it's hard to unlearn that overnight. Father Noah nodded thoughtfully. Faith is a journey, not a destination. Questioning and re-examining what you've been taught is part of developing a mature spirituality. We continued, setting up as we talked, our conversation moving between theology and personal experience. Father Noah shared more about his own faith journey, including a period of doubt during seminary when he questioned his calling. I think God values authenticity above certainty, he said as we finished arranging the last table. Being honest about your questions and struggles is more important than having all the answers. Before I could respond, the door opened and other volunteers began arriving. The intimate space of our conversation dissolved as we turned to greet them and explain the day's tasks. But throughout the afternoon, I was aware of Father Noah's presence in a way I hadn't been before. His easy laugh as he joked with elderly parishioners, his patience with the children who had come to help, the quiet authority with which he directed the operation when the work was done and most volunteers had departed. I lingered, helping to clean up the last few items. Father Noah approached as I was wiping down a table. Would you like to get coffee? He asked, surprising me. There's a small place a few blocks from here. I could use the caffeine after today, and I'd enjoy continuing our conversation. The invitation caught me off guard, but I nodded. I'd like that. 20 minutes later, we were settled at a corner table in a cozy cafe I'd passed countless times but never entered. Father Noah had changed out of his clerical collar into a simple blue sweater that brought out the color of his eyes. Without the formal attire, he looked younger, more approachable. It was strange seeing him this way, like encountering a teacher outside school. For the first time, I come here often to write my sermons, he said, wrapping his hands around a steaming mug of black coffee. The owners don't mind if I sit for hours with just one drink. What's your sermon about tomorrow? I asked, genuinely curious. He smiled slightly. Authenticity and faith. It was already planned before our conversation last week, but it feels particularly relevant now. Will you? I hesitated, uncertain how to phrase my concern. Mention you, he finished. No, of course not. Not everything you've shared with me is confidential, Henry. I relaxed slightly. I appreciate that I'm not ready for everyone to know yet. Coming out is a personal process, he affirmed. Each person has to determine their own timeline and approach. No one should rush you or force you. Our conversation flowed easily from there. We discovered Aired shared interests in classic literature and folk music, he told me. About growing up in a small town in the Midwest similar in many ways to our coastal community, I shared stories about my work at the library and my dream of someday writing a novel. The afternoon light faded to evening as we talked, and I was surprised when I glanced at my watch to see how much time had passed. I should probably go, I said reluctantly. My parents will wonder where I am. Father Noah nodded, though I thought I detected a similar reluctance in his expression. Of course, thank you for joining me. As we walked out of the cafe, a light rain had begun to fall. Father Noah insisted on walking me to my car, which I'd left in the church parking lot. We shared his umbrella, walking close together to stay dry. The proximity felt both comforting and unsettling in a way I couldn't quite articulate. At my car, I turned to thank him again for the coffee and conversation. The words died on my lips as I noticed the way he was looking at me with an intensity that hadn't been there before, or perhaps that I hadn't allowed myself to recognize. Henry, he said softly, I want you to know how much I valued our conversations, how much I valued getting to know you. There was something in his voice that made my heart beat faster. I valued them too, I replied, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. He seemed on the verge of saying something more, then appeared to think better of it. I'll see you tomorrow at service, I nodded, suddenly unable to form words. He smiled, a brief, almost sad gesture, then turned and walked back toward the church, the umbrella bobbing above him in the gentle rain. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, trying to make sense of the strange energy that had arisen between us. Had I imagined it? Was I projecting my own confused feelings onto a man who had simply shown me kindness and acceptance? I drove home in a daze, barely aware of the familiar streets passing by my window. That night, I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with fragments of our conversations and images I couldn't quite recall. Upon waking Sunday morning, arrived with clear skies and a knot of anticipation in my stomach, I dressed carefully for church, taking more time than usual to select clothes and style my hair. My mother noticed, commenting that I looked particularly nice. As we drove to the service together, I mumbled something about a new shirt and stared out the window, avoiding her curious gaze. At church, Father Noah was once again in his clerical attire, performing his duties with the same grace and warmth I'd always observed his sermon as he'd mentioned, centered on authenticity and faith, on the importance of bringing one's whole self to a relationship with God rather than presenting a carefully curated version. Though he didn't look at me directly during his address, I felt as though the words were meant specifically for me. After the service, I stood with my parents in the receiving line. When we reached Father Noah, he greeted my parents warmly, inquiring after my father's health and promising to visit them later in the week. When he turned to me, his expression remained professionally friendly, but there was a depth to his eyes that seemed to communicate something private. Good to see you, Henry, he said, clasping my hand. His touch lingered just a moment longer than strictly necessary. Will you be helping with the youth group meeting this afternoon? I hadn't planned to, but I found myself nodding. Yes, I can be there. Wonderful. We'll need all the